And for more, we're very pleased to be joined by Chris Smith, contributing editor at New York Magazine, and he's covered obviously a whole lot of figures in and around our area. But speaking of this mayor, he wrote a piece back in September, called "Autocrat for the People," and the subhead says it: "When the richest man of the city is also the one who runs it," an assessment of an extraordinary era. And Chris, that's probably the best way to say it. A tumultuous 12 years, but I just think, and I remember candidate Bloomberg, and he had on this, I think it was a bright pink cardigan, walking down the streets of, I think it was Staten Island. I was saying, man, this guy might be able to buy this seat here, but he'll never get it. He'll never relate. He kind of never tried, but he came a lot closer than a lot of people would have thought back then. Really unprecedented what we've seen in the last dozen years, right?
Sure, and you hit it exactly right. The gap between people's feeling for Bloomberg and Bloomberg's feeling for people at large versus what he's actually done for the bulk of New Yorkers is one of the fascinating splits in this 12 years. That, yes, he's a multi-billionaire, in many ways has been true to character throughout. I mean, that's where you start, I think, in defining the Bloomberg era is with business. You know, he was elected largely for two reasons: all the money he spent in his campaigns, and initially the city reeling from the September 11th attacks, and there being real questions about New York as a business center, as a place where people could find jobs, where growth would continue. And Bloomberg consistently, unabashedly in these 12 years has been a pro-growth, pro-business mayor for good and ill. I mean, we have a picture of the skyline behind me, and you look around New York and pretty much any direction you turn, there is a physical representation of how Mike Bloomberg has changed the city, from the Upper West Side, where Hudson Yards is still not finished, but is going to be a mini city, and mini is a wrong word because it's massive in every respect. Hudson Yards, in many ways, will be a Bloombergville. Right outside the door here at the studio, and in many places around the city, are city bikes, you know, which people are pedaling all over the place down the bike lanes that he expanded everywhere, you know, to the farthest reaches of the boroughs, where he expanded, acquired parkland, did a lot of high-end things, you know, that are a mixed bag in terms of condo development, in terms of tourist attractions. But what's unappreciated, I think, is how many jobs that created, how much it did spread the wealth in certain respects throughout the city, but not enough and not evenly, as Bill de Blasio certainly hammered home during the campaign.
You know, there was a number in your piece you wrote that 40% of the city landmass has been rezoned. If you think about that, I didn't realize it until I read that nearly half of the city's been rezoned, but yet you get an impression from some folks, I think people forget, and you remind them in the article, when he walked in, he had to close a $5 billion gap. That's just for the city of New York that he had to deal with, and he did, and I think people kind of just accepted that, okay, this is probably the most competent guy in the room when it comes to the math here. We're going to go along with this because he frankly makes it pretty clear that he is the smartest guy in the room. But with that, I think it was years before people really started drilling down and wondering if in crime, and in education, and in housing, Chris, the ledger at the end says this was good for all 5 boroughs, not just Manhattan. Go through those. Like we said, from crime and stop and frisk, obviously, to education and the test scores with some debate, and then finally with housing, where many people say that's the, if you want an example of have and have-nots, there it is.
Sure. Crime, in simplest terms, thousands more people are alive today than would have been had not Bloomberg and Kelly been so successful in driving down crime pretty much across the board, but most dramatically in shootings and homicides. You know, there's going to be 350 or so deaths this year, murders. You know, it was over 600 when Bloomberg took office, and a whole lot higher just a few years before that. Do he and Kelly get all the credit for that? Certainly not. You know, the cops on the street deserve most of it, demographic trends, all sorts of other things. But a lot of the tactics that were used as they kept pushing harder and harder, the statistics, the numbers-driven element of the police department kind of took over. And that's where the number of stop and frisks skyrocketed. You had hundreds of thousands of innocent people, mostly black and brown, in the poorer neighborhoods across the city being stopped and harassed. So, yeah, there's a real residue of tension and friction. The tactics were enormously effective on the one hand, but enormously intrusive on the other. And let's not forget, in that same respect, both effective and intrusive, there has not been a terrorist attack on New York in 12 years, and thank God in all sorts of ways for that. Mm-hmm. But Kelly and Bloomberg did a lot of things, particularly in the surveillance of Muslim neighborhoods, mosques, that they thought was necessary. And, you know, they point to the bottom line that no one has been killed or attacked by terrorists here in the city. But there's a lot of civil liberties questions and outright violations involved in that record. You move to education, much more mixed bag. You know, a huge victory at the outset, gaining mayoral control of the public school system from the state of New York. And Bloomberg exploited that control, you know, hiring Joel Klein, a lawyer with a corporate background, restructuring the school system, again, introducing a very data-driven, test-driven approach. There are more good schools in the city than there ever have been, or certainly at the start of the Bloomberg term. But the way he got there, yeah, broke up a lot of the old power structures, irritated the teachers union, heavy emphasis on putting money and energy into creating charter schools. And, you know, you have a lot of teachers and students and parents now rebelling at just how test-driven the school system has become. And there are still enormous pockets, bigger than pockets, enormous difficulties with the kids who are toughest to educate. We still have 35% of the school population that doesn't graduate, and that's going to be really hard to move in a positive direction. Housing, Bloomberg built or preserved is the term, you know, made sure or brought online close to 100,000 apartments over his time in office. But that's, you know, pushing back the tide in a lot of respects. The success of the Bloomberg era, making New York more attractive to people all over the world, making New York more expensive, you know, that is outstripping his efforts to build more affordable housing for the middle and lower class income folks. So, yeah, that's a tremendous divide that's been worsened by the Bloomberg years. Could he have done more? Probably. You know, could have pushed for more housing in more places. And we'll see if de Blasio is able to do it any better.
You know, he's a paradox in a lot of ways. I mean, I think only maybe in New York could it fly where he says, I'm not telling you where I'm going for the weekend. That's my time. You know, go scratch. But at the same time, any kind of criticism, he is, as you know, extremely sensitive on it. Speak a little bit to the man himself, and I mean, how even some of his issues like smoking bans. You wouldn't have thought from a guy who was so macro and big picture that he would drill down on these issues, and I think it will be probably on the, you know, on the credit side of the ledger for him when it's all said and done. But he's a mixed bag as a person, isn't he?
Certainly. And, you know, the positive side of that kind of thick skin, it's been caricatured as being out of touch with the common New Yorker. The positive side of that is he had political insulation to do things that a lot of other traditional, conventional politicians couldn't. Smoking ban is the greatest example. Bloomberg came into office with a record and an interest in public health. He really ramped that up over the time in office and pushed through the smoking ban, enormously unpopular then, totally accepted and popular and widely imitated now. So, you know, hundreds of thousands of people are healthier for not smoking, and they have Bloomberg to thank. He wasn't warm and fuzzy in explaining how and why he was going to make that happen, and how and why it was good for people. He never tried to fake public empathy. He wasn't good at it. On the other hand, yeah, like you say, he let his feelings be known, particularly his crankiness with reporters frequently. Anybody who opposed him, you know, he had his run-ins with Albany certainly, and wasn't shy about saying what he thought of the competence and ethics of folks at the state legislature. But I think people underestimate him or misunderstand him in the sense that he does have a real bond with folks who are struggling to make it. I mean, Bloomberg himself came from a very middle-class background, achieved what he did in large part through education, through getting a break and going to Johns Hopkins, and then just working hard every step of the way. Didn't come from money, earned it, had a great idea, built a fortune. And anybody, particularly immigrants, who he sees in a similar boat, you know, he's extraordinary both in his personal feeling and in his actions in trying to help those people. And someone asked me the other day, well, you know, other than yelling at reporters, you know, did he ever show emotion? And I always think back to a funeral probably 6 or 7 years ago for two detectives, undercover detectives on Staten Island, who were shot and killed trying to make a gun buy. And Bloomberg speaking at their funeral, the funeral for one of the detectives, and he, yes, was choked up, he was tearful, but it wasn't just to score sympathy points. You know, he felt it deeply, and then he went out and did something about it. You know, he redoubled efforts both locally and nationally to get guns off the street. You know, you've seen in my story where he talked at length about how what New York City needs is to get all the Russian billionaires to move here, yep, you know, to pay for all the social programs. He does have a tin ear, and that didn't change. He's too old for it to change now. He doesn't care about changing it, really. But there's a difference between the hard-hearted sounding things he's said and the policy actions he's taken to actually help people.